Not this one. Okay. Let me open my Zoom then.
Both if you can put the mic close enough. Like,
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SFO Roundtable Aircraft Noise Terminology Tutorial. This evening, we have with us our technical consultant, Gene Reindell, who will take us into this session. And I want to thank Gene ahead of time for all the work that he has done along with our superhero Kathleen, and Bert Ganong also will be available to answer questions. With that, I'm going to go ahead, and after Gene is done with his presentation, we're going to open it up for questions to all of us as well as to the members of the public. If we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, there will be a little bit more time available during the regular meeting, which starts at 7 p.m. So don't worry, we will answer all your questions, time permitting. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gene.
all right. Thank you. And we'll wait a minute until Angela brings up the presentation, then we'll go ahead and get started on the noise metrics presentation. Okay. This is a presentation I put together because there's been a lot of questions over the last few months about different noise metrics and their usefulness and what are they and what do they mean. So if you go to the next slide, we can go ahead and get started. It's a purpose is really to become familiar with aircraft noise terminology, to understand single event noise levels and metrics, and then to also understand cumulative noise levels and metrics. And so the outline today is talking about the definitions of commonly used metrics and how the single events build up to the cumulative events or noise levels. And then also introduction to other noise metrics. Next slide. Up one, I think. You went two, I think. Okay. All right. So where humans hear best is the A-weighted noise level. And what you can see there in that graph, if I'm on slide 3, I believe. 10 in the back. It does. Yes, it does. So here I show both the A-weighted and the C-weighted. C-weighting represents what humans hear when the sounds are very loud. And we don't experience noise levels like that in our environment. Even if you're close to an aircraft taking off, you still will typically hear at in the A weighting, although you start to, as sounds get a little bit louder than that, even you do hear them in C weighting. And you can see that we then detect at really high noise levels more low frequency noise. And you can see instead of a 50 decibel reduction at about 20 hertz, it's actually only a 5 decibel reduction on the C weighting. And so again, A weighting is what we hear typically in our environment and the sounds that we hear day to day. C weighting really represents how humans hear, but at really high volumes of noise, such as 120 dB of, like if you're a riveter on an aircraft manufacturer and you're riveting, those sounds are like 120 to 130, and you certainly hear more in C weighting in those very high noise levels. Next slide. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide in particular. What you're seeing on the right there is, we're on slide 6 of the presentation. What in the packet,
13.
Slide 13 in the packet. And so the graph on the right there, think of it as an aircraft is approaching where you're at, flying overhead, it's coming towards you, the sound gets higher and higher until it reaches its maximum sound level, and then as it goes away from you, the noise level drops. So you're looking at noise level on the left axis in decibels, and those are A-weighted decibels, and then you're just looking at time on the x-axis. And so that's really important because you're going to see graphs like this throughout the day going through noise levels. And just remember that that's what we're talking about, is as an aircraft approaches, it gets louder and louder, and then as it goes away, it gets quieter and quieter. And so the maximum sound level of that noise event, of that single aircraft flyover, is often termed Lmax. Pretty simple. And what Lmax means is the maximum noise level that occurred. And so Lmax accounts really only for the sound amplitude. It doesn't tell you how much noise energy there was, how long it lasted, and it often doesn't correlate well to people's subjectiveness of how loud that really was. Lmax is one number, but you'll see that we have other metrics to better describe the noisiness, if you will, of a sound. Because two events may have the same maximum level, but they'd be perceived much differently in total noise level. Next slide. Here's just, we put together this, what we call thermometer, but it's of noise levels, where you have common outdoor sound levels on the left and some common indoor sound levels on the right, just to kind of get you familiar with what noise levels are. Our threshold of hearing is really around 0. That's by definition about where a healthy young person can hear, is about somewhere between 0 and 10 decibels. And then, like a vacuum cleaner at 3 feet, so you're operating the vacuum cleaner, it's probably around 65, 70 decibels, just to kind of put things into perspective. A lawnmower at 3 feet, again, you operating the lawnmower, well, the older gas ones, not the electric ones now. Electric ones are much quieter, but the old gas lawnmower is about 95 decibels or so. So just kind of a range in there to kind of help people understand, and those are maximum levels. So next slide. So one of the easier to describe metrics, if you will, is time above a threshold level, also referred to as TA. And it's really simply, if you look at that graph, if you wanted to know the time above 60 decibels, and that red line there is showing the 60 decibel threshold, you simply count the number of seconds that noise event, that aircraft flyover, that noise event, was above 60 dB, and you see it's 38 seconds. And so time above, you can put that into an hourly metric, how much time above an hour or how much time above in a day. So it's pretty easy to understand the time above metric. It's simply how long did that sound level exceed that level. What isn't as easy to correlate is how people perceive that, because you have to be there to experience all of them during the day, right? And so, does a full day make sense when you're probably not at home all day? Maybe, a peak hour or something, how much noise above a threshold is more understandable, and people kind of do understand that more. So time above is just not as easy to subjectively determine personally how loud it is at a person's location, but it does start to help. Next slide. Number of events above a threshold. I think you've heard some people talking about this. It's called N above, or N80 or N70. If you see things like that, that just means how many events were there that exceeded that noise level. So in this graph here, you can see the number of events during that 1 hour was 1 for 80 decibels. So N80 is 1. There was just one noise event that exceeded 80 decibels. And so then you can see that there were 3 events that exceeded 70 decibels during that hour, and 6 events that exceeded 60 decibels in that hour. So that metric is really just a count of how many operations there were above a certain level. If you had, N0 and you just wanted to calculate all the times an aircraft went over, that's the same as the number of operations that flew over your house, right? So eventually that's what you get to as you lower that level. Basically, you're just counting every single aircraft that went over your house during that day or during that period of evaluation. So N above may actually be useful for evaluating things like sleep disturbance. Maybe how many aircraft were above a certain noise level during the times you're sleeping. Maybe that's important to understand, because we know that people are awakened from aircraft noise, and probably the more they experience, maybe the more likely they may be awakened. So there are uses to that as well. So hopefully you're understanding these metrics. They kind of do build on each other, but if there are things you're not understanding, we can certainly talk about them at the end as well. But that's what number of above is, and that's what SFO has started to report. And I think they're reporting on a monthly average. Is that right, Bert? And so that's what they're reporting in their reports now, is how many events each month occur at certain noise levels, at or above certain noise levels. Next slide. Okay, now we're starting to get more of the cumulative metric. The SEL now, or SENEL in California, they're synonymous, but it accounts for noise level and event duration. What the SEL or SENEL really is the total noise energy of that noise event. And I think I have a graphic of this on the next slide, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so here again, we're looking at 2 aircraft flyovers, if you will. One had an Lmax of 78 at its highest point. The next one had an Lmax of 74. So you would think 78 should have sounded louder, but people on these 2 examples, more people thought the second one sounded noisier. And that's because if you look, it actually had more noise energy. So what we're showing in that graph is that what SEL and SENL really are doing is saying, if all that energy occurred in 1 second, what would that value be? Okay? And so the value for the first one is 82 decibels for SENEL, whereas the second one was 87 because it lasted longer. It didn't have a higher Lmax than the other one, but because it lasted longer, it sounded noisier, and it indeed does have a higher SENEL. Next slide. Now I wanted to give us a sample calculation here, and I don't expect you all to know how to calculate SEL. What I want you to understand here is the importance of getting the highest noise levels of an event to determine the accuracy of how well you can determine SEL or SENEL. So you see there the maximum noise level of this event is around 85 decibels. And if you take just the top, if you were to only measure 80 to 85, the SEL becomes 87.12. But then if you measure the top 10 decibels, or go between 75 and 85, you get 87.55. And if you get all of the noise exposure all the way down to the ambient level down there, you actually get 87.83 for that SENEL. And so what we often say is if you can get the top 10 decibels of that noise, meaning L max and the 10 dB below that, you know it within at least within a half a decibel, which is probably okay. And so that's what noise monitoring systems try to do, is get at least that top 10 dB of SEL and count. Then they know it's an aircraft, and that is the actual noisiness of that aircraft noise event. Next slide. The next one is the equivalent sound level. And you see there, we're using that, going back to that same graphic again, and it shows that what the LEQ is there, about 75 decibel LEQ, whereas it had a maximum of about 81 or 82, and it was, the top 10 dB was like 70 to 80, top 20 was 60 to 80, that sort of thing. But overall, LEQ was about 75. What does that mean? That means that during that 1 minute, if you had a steady state signal and wanted that same noise energy as a steady state signal, it would be that 75 dB. So that is another way to show what the total noise energy is, but it's not really the total noise energy in this case, it's the equivalent, meaning what is the equivalent sound level on a flat number to account for the the time varying sound level in an actual event. So LEQ is time averaged, and it accounts for the noise level and time, and it's a cumulative metric. And what's important, if you ever see an LEQ, you need to also understand what is the time period in which it was averaged. In this case, we're looking at a 1 minute LEQ. Oftentimes, you might have an LEQ for a whole noise event, that you've captured a noise event, so you could say it's a noise event LEQ rather than saying exactly how long, because each of them will be different lengths of time. You often see LEQ for 1 hour, so 1 hour LEQ, or a 24-hour LEQ. And I know I haven't gotten to what CNEL or DNL is, but it's essentially a 24-hour LEQ, but with weighted additions to noise levels during the evening for CNEL and night for CNEL and DNL. So you'll just try to remember that as we get back to DNL, but basically a 24-hour LEQ would be synonymous with a 24-hour DNL, except for you get a 10 dB weighting for those factors, for those noise levels at night. Okay, next slide. So the day-night average sound level, or DNL, and the graphs to the right kind of show what a DNL is really doing is taking all of those aircraft noise events that you have measured or modeled, put them in, determine in California, Title 21 requires that you actually determine aircraft noise over an hour. So the next slide down shows all the events that occurred during an hour, and then you can determine the hourly noise level from those events. And then you add them all up also for 24 hours, and that is where you get a DNL, which accounts for event noisiness, because it's using that SEL as the basis, or SENEL. It accounts for the number of those noise events, and it provides an additional weighting for nighttime operations. And if you go to the next slide, it shows exactly how that's done on an hourly basis. You can see the hourly noise levels for each of the hours from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. showing here, and between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. it adds 10 decibels to the actual hourly noise levels to come up with a DNL of 66 decibels for that. And so, like I said earlier, DNL is also an LEQ, you might see DNL also referenced as LDN, meaning level day-night. And that's the more scientific scientific term rather than DNL is an acronym and LDN is a scientific equivalent. Next slide. All right, I just wanted to show this equation, not to think you can get your calculators out and start to calculate DNL, but I wanted to show a couple of interesting things here is that what that, you see the funny looking symbol that's actually a summation and then 10 to the power of an SEL up there, you see that? So what that's saying is it's adding up all those noise events, all the SELs from the noise events over the 24-hour period. Okay, that's what DNL is doing. And then if you see the 86,400, that's the number of seconds in a day. Okay, so that's where you get your average for the 24 hours is that you divide by, because remember SEL puts all the sound energy into a second. So then you have to divide by all the seconds in a day. And when you do that, you can also move that 86,400 outside of the logarithmic scale there. And you can see there it's equivalent to subtracting 49.4. So I think this is one of the things that I would have suggested the EPA actually not use an average, but come up with a day-night level and just get rid of the average, because the average just subtracts essentially 50 dB. So you know how we've been talking about DNL or CNEL of 65, that's the threshold in which land use compatibility may start? What if you added 50 to that? And we now are saying it's 115. And that's actually the total noise that people are experiencing. And if you told people that, they would believe you because they have these aircraft going over at 90 dB and 85 dB. And yeah, if you added them all up, it should be 115. They don't get how you add them all up and it becomes 65. And that's why. It's because it's an average, and how they averaged it was over the 86,400 seconds in a day.
And it's not weighted at all for nighttime, is it?
It is.
It is,
So,
okay.
yeah, go back, because that was actually a good question. So you see the WI there next to SEL? So what you do is SEL plus 10 if it's at night. Okay.
I have a follow-up question on that. So does that mean they want it to be quieter at night, so they just automatically add the 10 dBL? So that
It's actually the opposite of that. People find noise during the night to be twice as loud as the same level they experience during the day. And twice as loud is about 10 dB. So they added 10 dB to nighttime operations because people subjectively find them to be twice as loud. The same noise level at night that you have during the day, people find those noise levels to be twice as loud.
Why? So you get credit for a higher dB at night.
Yes, it's a higher dB.
It's
So,
a help
so if you
too.
had an SEL of 90 that flew over at night, it's actually an SEL of 100 that's put into this equation. It's actually weighted higher because, again, people experience that.
But the reason is to force airplanes to be quieter at night than they have to be during the day.
No.
Nothing like that.
No, it's just, you want to say something, Bert? Anyway, it's just a metric. Remember, this is a noise metric. This is not what aircraft are flying to. This is not what, this is how we are measuring aircraft and how we're reporting aircraft noise.
But it does result in a benefit to the resident, because this is a number that qualifies them for noise mitigation.
Right, it increases the
So It
LEQ.
makes it easier to qualify. You can't really change,
Gene?
airplane
Right.
makes this much noise.
Another way to
Because they make
put it out there for the
Flight
folks is
information.
one aircraft is the equivalent of 10 at night.
Right.
Why do human beings perceive it twice as loud in the evening versus the?
Okay, so the question, yep. So the question was, why do people perceive nighttime events as being louder and twice as loud as daytime events? There's a number of reasons for that. I personally think it's because other noises aren't prevalent anymore, like especially if you're in a suburban area, traffic has died down by then. You're getting ready to go to bed, or you are sleeping. So your house is even quieter, you don't have the TV on anymore. All those things attribute to that, to where you, again, if an aircraft comes over at 75 decibels during the day, you would think, yeah, that was 75 decibels, but with everything else quieting down around you and that flew over again, it's much more noticeable, and it would sound more like 85 during the night. So that's where that perception comes in.
So reality is still 75, perception's 85.
Exactly. And then the DNL includes that perception of that twice as loud. Okay.
So, I'm sorry, just one quick follow-up. So that's sort of, it's a guesstimate to ambient noise levels and how it changes, but it's not really a measurement, right? It's something
It's
we're
not a measurement,
assuming
you just
for
add 10
everything,
dB
right.
to the noise at night.
Okay.
So I wanted to put here also some outdoor DNL levels and what they're like. So a suburban area DNL is around 55 DNL. A noisy urban or a very noisy urban is like 65 to 75. And you can see on the right there some actual locations that were measured back in the 70s, so it's not realistic necessarily of today, but a tomato farm in California was back in the 70s about 45 DNL, and then a housing or row housing in Boston, the ambient was almost 70, but I bet some of the urban, I don't think we have the 85 to 90 DNLs in LA anymore. You know, cars have gotten quieter and, you know, noises, we've made noise regulations in cities to where you can't have super loud noises at night, so.
So your point is this, that it may no longer be 45, it's not that perception.
No, it's now perception. This is actually what it was back in 1976 or so when they measured these. Okay, next slide. So here's what Bert was alluding to a little bit earlier about the number of aircraft events. What Bert was saying, that for DNL, the 10 decibel weighting at night is equivalent to the 10 of those operations occurring rather than just one. What we've done here, though, is shown you that you could have one aircraft flyover, like a fighter jet, of 115 dB, and you'll get a DNL of 65 just from that one operation. And remember now that it's DNL is the actual level minus 49.5. So you have this one event, you basically are subtracting that 49.5 to get the 65 decibels. Or you could have 10 events, 10 decibels less to get a DNL of 65. So you could have 10 events at that location at 104 dB and still get a DNL of 65. Or you could have 100 events at 94 dB and get a 65. So, you know, it really depends on what the aircraft types are, how loud each of the aircraft events are, and how many of them you get. And that is all calculated into DNL, as well as time of day. You know, if it's at night, again, it's a penalty of 10 times. Next slide. So now looking at the community noise equivalent level, which is what
Recording in
California uses with the Title 21. And, we're getting that, give me a second. Can I go directly in now? Right, okay. I'm gonna try to mute and just use the mic. Give me a second. Oh, now it's not echoing. All right, I'll continue. So what I was starting to say is Title 21 for California, which came out just before the federal regulations of what metric to use. California determined that they wanted to use a community noise equivalent level, which includes an additional weighting during the evening hours between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. And so during those 3 hours, you actually get a 3 times weighting, or about a 5 decibels added to the noise levels during that time period. And then during at night, you still get that 10 dB added during the night between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And it really just depends on how many evening operations you have in an airport as to how different DNL and CNEL are. And when the FAA made their policy they determined that California could continue to use CNEL because their analysis back then showed it wasn't all that much different anyway. And because California had that in their regulations already, they allowed them to use it. So that's what CNEL is. It's basically almost the same as DNL, just with evening noises also increased during the night. And California did that because that's when they figured that families are home watching TV, doing homework, you know, things like that, and have windows open. So anyway, that's why I think California did that. Next slide.
Hey, Gene, why is 3x weighting is additional 5 dBs and 10x weighting is 10 dB?
That's a good question. So why is the evening 3 times the weighting, which is almost 5 dB, whereas nighttime is 10 times the weighting and 10 dB? Because we're using 10 log math, and so by definition, 10 times is a full number so 10 is actually 10 in logarithmic, whereas 3 times the energy, you take 10 times the log of 3 and you get 4.7 dB. So that's just what they wanted. They thought if nighttime was 10 times, evening should be 3 times, and 3 times is almost 5 dB.
Is this based on the formula?
Yes, it's based on the logarithmic math that goes into determining what a decibel is. Okay, let's see here. I think you can go back one slide. Yeah, so the next metric I want to talk about is the effective perceived noise level, or EPNL. And all that you really need to know, well, a couple things you need to know about that. It's essentially a sound exposure level, or SEL or SENEL, because it does take into account duration. But in addition to duration, it also takes into account the presence of pure tones in the noise. And this is the metric that aircraft manufacturers have to use to certify their aircraft. Back in the day, during the like 727s and 707 aircraft that were flying, the really much louder aircraft than we have today, there was a lot of pure tones in those noise levels. So pure tone is in a frequency, all of a sudden it goes really high in one specific frequency, and people find pure tones very annoying. And so what aircraft manufacturers have been able to do as a result of this metric is get rid of almost all pure tones in their noise levels. And so EPNL and SEL are now, because there aren't the pure tones left in there, they're essentially the same metric, but it's still what the manufacturers are held to certify their aircraft is the effective perceived noise level rather than just the SEL, which is good because it makes sure that they don't introduce pure tones. And so you want to continue to have them use that metric. Next slide. What this is showing are just other cumulative 24-hour metrics and where they're used in different parts of the world. I already talked about DNL and CNEL, and I also said that the LEQ 24 is essentially the same as DNL, CNEL, except it doesn't have the weightings applied to them. And you can see the weightings by day, evening, and night, and so LEQ has no weightings, they're all ones. And then you have the LDEN. Very similar to CNEL, except for the European Union, when they came up with this metric, wanted to be able to define what is day, evening, and night. Whereas DNL defines night, and it is defined by the DNL metric as being between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., and CNEL defines evening as 7 to 10 p.m. So what the European Union did with their LDEN is left it up to the local municipalities as to what they want to define in their communities as day, evening, and night. Then the last two are some that are rarely used. The NEF, or Noise Exposure Forecast, it's based off of EPNL rather than SEL. And it's actually still used in Canada, though Canada is reviewing their policy right now and may actually go to something like LDEN rather than the noise exposure forecast. Because the noise exposure forecast and EPNL is really hard to calculate. You need a pretty robust spreadsheet to do that calculation, whereas CNEL and DNL uses an SEL and it's just straight from the measurements. And then the last one is weighted equivalent continuous perceived noise level, or WECPNL. It is also using the EPNL metric, and the only place I'm aware that it is still used is in China. Japan was the ones that started using that, but Japan has gone, I think, to the LDEN as well as like the European Union, but China is still using that other one. Next slide. The FAA does have in their guidance recommended uses of supplemental metrics. They require that you use DNL and you evaluate DNL or CNEL in California to determine land use compatibility, but they have allowed for use of sound exposure level for analysis of noise abatement flight tracks and procedures. They've allowed the use of LMAX, or maximum sound level, for same type of analysis for flight procedures, or for the assessment of speech or sleep interference, because it has been shown that indoor noise above about 65 decibels starts to interfere with speech communication. And so that's a real issue with children's learning, for example, and so that's something that we use as LMAX. And there also time above, which is the next one on there, time above an LMAX, or time above a threshold rather. So if you did time above 65, like in a classroom, that would be really informative, because how many minutes of the day is the noise level at a level that's too high to have good, verbal communication inside a classroom. And then the equivalent noise level, they want to use that for analysis of schools. So, schools typically aren't used during the night. And so if a school is indeed not doing instruction during the night, there are some schools that actually do go into the night, but most, of our K through 12 are daytime. So they want you to calculate actually a school time LEQ to better understand the environment there rather than having the DNL or CNEL for the schools. And then number of events, not quite, number of events above a threshold, that they don't really know how to use it yet. I think they're really starting to look at that based on some work we've done at other airports with number of events above a threshold, but for now it's just for informational purposes. And what I want to leave you with before we get to the next slide, which is going over any further questions, is that you see the footprints there on that last slide showing the noise level. What you're looking at there is an aircraft arriving from the left and the departing to the right. And so that's the noise signature, if you will, of that aircraft. And it's using sound exposure level. But I can tell you, you can use any of the metrics that I've talked about tonight, and HMH has done a study on most of the metrics that I talked about tonight. And if you contoured them, they're going to look very similar to this SEL, very similar to a DNL, very similar to even number of events above a threshold, because that's just the way noise follows the aircraft, right? And so whatever the noise is from the aircraft, those contours. And so one of the things that a lot of people have been asking for are different noise metrics, but really to use a different noise metric, you would get the same thing if you just used a different threshold, if it wasn't going out far enough into your community. Because you could use number of above 80 dB or something around there, and that might be exactly where the 65 DNL is. And so, it's not a matter of the metrics, but the metrics do help explain the noise environment in which you live. And I think that's what's important. And there are uses like the FAA has recommended here and how you use some of those other metrics. But really, at the end of the day, if you contour any of those metrics, they're going to look a lot like what you're used to in seeing the CNEL contours. Next slide. So hopefully you become a little bit more familiar with aircraft noise terminology, specifically the single event and cumulative noise metrics. And so if there are any other questions, we have, it looks like about 5 minutes or so that we can start the regular meeting on time.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gene. Very pleased to see interaction during your presentation, but definitely open the floor for anyone who has any further questions. Just feel free to raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you and then go for it.
Gene, you're not saying on that last slide that the metrics all yield the same result, therefore you don't need the different metrics, are you? You're still
No.
acknowledging the different metrics serve a different purpose for what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that the different metrics are going, what I'm saying is they're going to look very similar in shape. And that the size is going to be determined by all of them in what your threshold is. What contour are you showing? And so that's why I said the 65 DNL may be very close to a number of events above 80 contour at, say, 50 events a day or something like that. I'm just throwing that out there. But you could determine, what I'm saying is if you did number of events above a threshold and compared to the 65 DNL, you could come up with a number at an airport that would be equal to the 65 DNL, and it would be very close in shape.
Do you think there's something missing in terms of ambient noise, though? I mean, like a community like Millbrae by a freeway, has a lot more ambient noise even at night than the hillsides of Pacifica. And so, but the measurement doesn't really take that into account, right?
Are the questions being heard? Oh, okay. So, by policy currently, in both California and federal, the Title 21 in California and Part 150 and NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act in the US, by policy, you do not include ambient. It's only the noise metric is only reporting the source that you're intending to evaluate. And in this case, it's aircraft. So they're only taking into account aircraft noise and what those levels are. And so, yes, ambient noises are different everywhere. It can be important because, like I said, when people perceive noise levels at night as being 10 dB louder, and that's because it's much quieter at night. So if you go to a much quieter environment, you would probably similarly think, well, this is much louder than what it was in this noisier environment. So ambient does certainly play into perception of how loud things are and what the noise environment is at your place. And that's one of the reasons I brought up that thermometer showing the DNLs in different, types of neighborhoods, because it is different, so.
Okay, thanks.
Jean, I think your audio should be working now.
Mute your laptop and
So
speak.
can you hear
to the
me?
mic.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
Let it turn-
Testing.
Do you want to turn off your microphone?
No,
To transmit.
I'm not transmitting through Zoom. I think if I was transmitting, because now I unmuted. I was going to say I'd probably be getting an echo if I was transmitting. Are there other questions?
I have a question.
And, Kathleen.
I have a question, it's a little off topic but related. And that has to do with questions, I'm sorry. I'll just
Close at it,
close it. So my question has to do with, and this is also to Bert, I suppose, ANOMS, ANEM. Now, this is a method of obtaining data, right? Can you explain what one is, what the other is, what advantages are one, what disadvantages are to the other? Because that's something that comes up with regularity.
Sure. That's a good question, and it's a great segue from ambient discussion we just had, because if ambient was never an issue into how you would measure noise, ANEM and ANOMS would calculate the noise metrics the same. Okay, so what a NEAM is trying to do is improve the ability to measure aircraft noise in higher ambient noise levels. And so that's the difference. And we've talked quite a bit in some meetings about the noise thresholds that are set on certain noise monitors, and how the California Title 21 says it's supposed to be set at 55 decibels, but you can't always set the threshold at 55 decibels because you would never get a noise event because it's always above 55 in certain areas. And so then they had to raise it up in order to be able to find those events. Well, now, that was through the old ANOMS, and now with a NEAM, you don't need a threshold anymore. With a NEAM, you find an aircraft near a noise monitor, and then you go look at the time history of that noise monitor to see if you can find an event. So it's doing it the opposite. Rather than needing a noise event, a NEAM needs an airplane, and then it goes to find the noise event that was measured. We're getting really close to time, so. Any other questions?
Okay.
Should probably wrap this up.
All right, thank you very much, Gene. And I don't see any hands up from members of the public, but if you do regarding this presentation, we will do that at the regular meeting, which we will be starting in 2 minutes. And also for the members, if you have any further questions, again, we have the same opportunity. Okay, so now we're taking public comments now? Okay, so I'll open for public comments. If anyone would like to make any comments about this tutorial, please raise your hand. Anyone in the room? I don't see any. Angela, do we have any on Zoom? I see one hand up.
Yes,
Mary Jo
Chairman.
Freeman.
I will call on Mary Jo Fremont. Give me 1 second. Go ahead, Ms. Fremont.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. So thank you, Jean, for this exhaustive list of metrics. But I want to add some comments on what you just said, that NEAM is good at detecting aircraft noise in higher ambient noise. That's true, but NEAM is also good at detecting better detecting aircraft noise in low ambient noise because NOx threshold is too high. You don't count the aircraft, and typically the thresholds that are put by SFO at 60 dB typically, and that doesn't work in communities where the ambient noise is in the low 40s, like in Palo Alto, for instance. So a NEAM is really good because it will adapt and detect the aircraft noise based basically on your ambient noise. If the aircraft is louder than your ambient noise, it will be counted. If it's not, it won't be. So that's what works, and the analysis has been done, and people have looked at this. It's a much better method, there is no question, for many, many communities around this country. And I think people will adopt a NEAM more because it's much more real. It really reflects the true number of aircraft that are above the ambient noise. So that's why people should use a NEAM. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fremont. And with that, Chairman, we don't have any further hands raised.
Okay, thank you, Angela. With that, so we're gonna take 1 minute recess, or we could definitely stop, but let's take 1 minute recess. Anyone wants to use the restroom or whatever you need to do, stretch, what have you, and then we'll convene the regular meeting in 1 minute.
1 minute stretch?
1 minute.
1 minute stretch.
I'm a tight ship, Sam.
Right, how are you? Nice to see you. We have a hopefully.